If you look at this game and you think this is just a game about being a cat, in one sense you're completely right, because it is about being a cat. And we're going to talk about what that means to be a cat. But the big surprise when you start it up is that it really is a journey into a literal abyss. The cat character you're playing falls into a dark hole and stumbles into a world that they didn't expect. And this world is one that is semi-familiar to us, but would be entirely unfamiliar to the cat. So you're putting yourself in a headspace of needing to wander through a culture that is not your own and enter into that heart of darkness and try to get out of it. It's a scary place that is also at the same time a very curious place. What's so fascinating about playing this cat and wandering through this world is there is a double layer of alienation happening as you play. You're playing a cat which is not you, it's not your body to be a cat. As you venture deeper into this abyss, you're also entering into a culture that isn't your own. You're doubly removed from what's happening in this space. You have to kind of wonder about, well, what is it like to be these machines wandering through a formerly human world, a world that wasn't designed for them that they then try to co-opt into their own life? And what is it like to be a cat entering into this world that again isn't designed for it, but it's trying to relate to creatures that aren't even flesh and blood, and yet it needs to cooperate with them? There's obviously bits of playing up the memeified quality of being a cat and what that means and why that's so adorable. But it's also a game about embodying something different than yourself. And that's worth pondering and wondering about. Wartime. There will come soft rains and the smell of the ground, and swallows circling with their shimmering sound, and frogs in the pools singing at night, and wild plum trees in tremulous white. Robins will wear their feathery fire, whistling their whims on a low fence wire, and not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. Not one would mind neither bird nor tree if mankind perished utterly, and spring herself when she woke at dawn would scarcely know that we were gone. As soon as the game opens up, you're staring at a group of cats, and it immediately sets the stage. You're a stray cat outside of the normal world, and it's just you and all these cats hanging out. The first prompt that you can see is to just play, playing for its own sake. From the very start of the game, you're just this cat, and you're just playing. You're joying in the freedom that you have. All the piping of the sewage, all the pathways and the railings along the edge, they have no meaning in terms of how we perceive their meaning. They are equivalent to tree branches in terms of their function to this cat. It's so nice to try to look at the world outside of how we are habituated to seeing the world. We take for granted so much of our day-to-day choices are sort of filtered by needing to accomplish something, get something done, or just avoid punishment. There's often like a kind of goal-oriented mediation of our actions. We are used to seeing things in terms of their function. If we see a hammer, we process it as ready to use in terms of actually hammering. If we see a railing, we consider it in terms of our hand sliding across it to hold us stable. When a cat sees the same thing, or sees a carpet, or sees a door, they're not thinking of it in exactly the same way. There's little pockets of time where I forget that I have a video game goal and a story to uncover, and I'm just experiencing human artifacts that I don't care for as an artifact, and I don't care for as its function. I only interact with it in terms of its shape and its sound and how it feels when I bump into it. And that's fun to play with mentally, like putting your thinking into a totally different kind of headspace. When you fall into the world of these robots, you immediately get choices on how to be a cat. You see carpets, you see couches, you see doorways, and you can just rub up against it and use your claws and carve it. If you see a paint can on the side of some crevice, you can push it over. If you see piping or stairways or small nooks, you can sneak your way in or climb up and hop. Immediately the game is trying to embody just being a cat. You get to play around with being really small. Not just being small, but being insignificant to most of the people around you. You get to just explore without anyone bothering you. So that's a kind of freedom that we don't get to experience as human beings. I really love that play element. You're going to platform through the world as a cat. It's not like platforming, like just jumping from spot to spot. You're quantifying distance for yourself and thinking like, can I make that jump? And then if I can, that's when the context sensitive button appears, and that's what actually lets you do the jump. I take all of that context sensitive button pressing as a mirror of just the cat's inner calculation of distance and what they're capable of. You're seeing pipes and you're seeing boxes and things, and you can decide to jump in or jump on top and move across the world. It's a very light platformer in that way, but it's really about looking at the world like how a cat would look at it, and then just thinking like, what could a cat be able to climb and what could a cat be able to do? Some of the later puzzles really become about what can a cat get away with that other people can't get away with? What can they fit in that other people can't? How can they break something in a convenient way that other people can't? You are cooperating with the features that a cat has and using that to help you overcome some of these challenges.
The game really does lean on tropes in terms of the gameplay, but it presents them in a novel form. Essentially platforming you would expect, but it's from the perspective of a cat. The twist on it is that you don't have to judge whether you're going to make a jump. That is guaranteed. There is no question that this cat is going to land on its feet. The game takes these conventions and it just presents them from a cat's perspective. The conventions themselves are very stereotypical. It's a game about platforming from point A to point B, occasionally doing some puzzles, doing some more platforming. There's even an action section where you have essentially a gun and you are encouraged to slaughter many living beings. It's conventional actually, but it always puts a twist on it. That is, how would a cat be an action hero in a game?
As much as the game tries to make us be a cat and like give us all these options of being a cat, and we get to be on the outside and like peek in and squirm through the world in a cat-like way, there's a lot of compromises that still have to be made in order to make it a functioning game. There's a lot of things that the cat has to do in this game world that is very specifically pointed toward us, the human player. It's like a compromise that takes the player out of being a cat. Like they can't fully invest in that role. For instance, when you're walking around, you'll see various arrows pointing you in different directions. Some of these arrows are being guided by the little AI companion that you eventually get, but some of the arrows are just signs, just kind of giving you clues to shortcuts. You'll see objects in the world like computers and keypads and radios, and you'll get objects like a tape that you can then put into a radio to distract an employee. The understanding of knowing that the tape goes into the radio and knowing that the tape will play music and knowing that the music will cause the employee to go to the back, all of that is from human experience. And this is a cat from the outside world, so it doesn't have that correlation yet. There's all sorts of little moments like that where you, the player, have to re-inject yourself into the head of this cat, and you can't just stay a cat. Now that seems to me a necessary compromise. I don't think it's like the fault of the game designers to do that. I think if they actually fully stuck to you being a cat, it would actually be overwhelmingly confusing for us. Being a cat is absolutely nothing like being us, and it's important to remember how different that mind is. We really are living in a world filled with alien beings whose sense of space and movement through that space is entirely unlike ours. There's this one idea that's been going around lately of questioning a little bit the ways in which we can truly know what it is that we see and taste and smell and touch as being physically exact with the real world, the epistemology that we can gain from our senses. Now this is a kind of skepticism that's existed since philosophers like Kant, where they separate things into analytic versus synthetic knowledge. But in this case, the skepticism is coming from just knowing the trajectory of how our senses came to be exactly how they are is one of natural selection. And natural selection is in terms of survival for the sake of procreation so that your genes can spread. Since our entire set of bodily functions is following that contingency of survival and procreation, it's not necessary for us to see things accurately. It's only necessary that it be isomorphic to the world to enough of a degree so that we can survive it and we can manipulate things within it. But anything that is superfluous to that, we wouldn't necessarily select for. One of the best things about optical illusions is they are reminders of how constructed our formation of objects is. We completely take for granted that when you look at a table, if you look at it from one angle and then you stand and look at it from a different angle, it's an entirely different shape. Our mind then has to take those two entirely separate shapes and formulate them as one single object mentally. Same thing with optical illusions. If it's just even remotely a little bit like a thing, our brain will fill it in. But if the information is superfluous, like colors being next to each other that our brain doesn't find useful, we literally can't see it. Even though we have the color cones literally in our eye, sending it to us, We can't see those things. There's a virtualization of our worlds. We're always virtualizing and gridding up every object in the world to then make a use out of it. But that virtualization is for human beings, a specific kind of selection towards survival. Now think of how different a cat's version of life must be. Their needs are completely separate from us. The kinds of things that we take for granted, like language isn't useful to a cat in quite the same way. Noises are, and sounds, and you can train a cat to follow certain sounds, but like the syntax of language is something that we learn as an instinct for our survival as a particular species, and that requires parsing sounds differently. Like right now, when you hear the sentence I'm saying right now, every single word is separated in your mind, but in terms of actual sound, it's one flowing set of noises. And to a cat, that's what it should be. That's not a judgment on the cat. I mean, the cat can perceive things that we can't even fathom. There's so much about being a cat that is completely unfathomable. This game has to compromise with us because there is a huge distance, a yawning chasm that we can never cross, no matter how hard we try, between us and these creatures that we interact with potentially on a daily basis. That distance actually left me feeling like I was in a different relation to this cat than perhaps the developers intended. Through a large chunk of the game, I was not actually in the headspace of the cat. I started to just be taking care of the cat. It felt to me like I was playing The Last Guardian. When you play The Last Guardian, you're this kid and you have this majestic being who's been around forever, and you're wandering with it through ruins. You're concerned about it, but you also need to use it to progress in this world, so you do so. You take advantage of what it's good at to help you get through the world. When I was playing as this cat, I very quickly stopped playing as the cat and just seeing the cat as an entity I was giving instructions to so that it can help me get through the world, but I also didn't want to hurt it. It made the scenes where it's in danger feel harrowing, not because I felt a simulacrum of being in danger, but just because I really cared about this creature separate from myself.
I did my best to kind of ignore this incongruity you're talking about because it really would have taken me out of it and it would have probably put me in that mindset. I was trying to avoid it as much as I could. I noticed very early on that I didn't really understand how it is that the robot interfaces with the cat at all. I didn't know what that means, right? Because the robot is supposedly translating things for you. But translating it into what? There's nothing to translate to. The cat doesn't understand the concept of communication in the same way. Immediately, I was like, I have to ignore this because this is going to fall apart if I keep thinking about this. What is it putting on the screen? Obviously, what I'm seeing is English words. But what does the cat see? I have no idea.
It would be one thing if the robot was only communicating bite-sized concepts, but a lot of the instructions were really elaborate. You know, like plan ahead and go enter this space and you're going to use this object in this particular way. And there's a key. What does the meaning of a key mean to a cat? Why would a cat understand a key? And none of this is to say anything about the minds of cats in terms of a judgment. The cats have such a richly complex life. So rich, in fact, that we literally could not fathom it, I don't think. Like, it's just so different from ours. The kind of communication they have is complex in an entirely separate way from us. It involves things that we really aren't conscious of. When that robot was translating things, even just putting arrows in places, I was thinking like, okay, this isn't for the cat, this is for me, the player. How funny. And this is of course necessary. This is part of all fiction. You have to suspend your disbelief to a certain degree. Because a cat's mind is truly, truly far out there in terms of what we're capable of comprehending, the game had to lean in toward familiarity for a human being. And a lot of the meaning in the story starts to come from that, of you just sort of recognizing the significance to a human of a lot of these things, even if some of the actions wouldn't necessarily be significant to a cat. Don't be confused to think that I'm saying that a cat couldn't care about some of these things. What I'm saying is that it would not necessarily be the case that they would, and to presume that much is to take for granted how different and special a cat really is from us, because they really are their own thing. And out of respect for cats, you have to consider how different that really would be.
A lot of your actions are motivated by your robot companion that is floating by you and kind of helping you interface with machinery and acting as your torch and helping you communicate with the robots around you. You have this symbiotic relationship with that robot, and that's really what drives the story forward. This robot helps give you a context for actually having gameplay, for actually having puzzles to solve. And the puzzles come from using your cat-like ingenuity to outsmart the pointless routines of a lot of these robots around you. Because they have these routines, the puzzle is always just to exploit those routines for your actual goals, because you do know what you want, because the robot has helped you figure it out.
It does give us a glimpse into what that must feel like to be an animal on the outskirts venturing into a society, and then a member of that society tries to take care of you. When that robot called B12 shows up, you do a little bit of work here and there to bring this AI companion online, and then that AI has a goal in mind that happens to coincide with yours, and so you work together. That AI in many ways is isomorphic with human beings taking care of a stray cat, in the sense that the human being will try to nudge the stray cat in different directions in order to take care of that cat, but the cat will always have ulterior motives underneath. Those will supersede in many cases the motives of the caretaker. You, this cat, get to follow the journey of, okay, this B12 character knows of outsiders, of characters in this world who can help you get outside and can also help the B12 discover information about its own situation. But then you, the cat, can spend hours just wandering around doing things for its own sake, exploring areas you're not supposed to be in, rubbing against things and just knocking things over. It's entirely up to you as a cat. We so rarely get to see cats in their element, really. A lot of cats, when we have them domesticated in our home, they become reliant on us in our home to the point that they begin to adapt their behavior around the expectation that we're going to do everything for them. Even stray cats, when we meet them, unless we only meet them for a brief fraction of a second, we will interact with them to enough of an extent that they will then develop expectations about interacting with us, and then they will change as a result of that relationship with us. We so very rarely get to see just cats being cats in the world. And the game opens with the cats being cats. That cat is put in a harrowing situation where it's suddenly weak and injured, and it needs to become subservient almost to another creature, but that will of its own, that will to do its own special thing, is still there. And we get to, as the player, get to just embody that, at least briefly.
The game is almost told through an environment that shapes your perspective. It shapes this idea of, I'm just going to do what I feel like doing, right? Which is sort of putting you in the mindset of a cat in a way. Because everything that you're supposed to do is also just, it's a little toy to play with. Early on, the way that you interact with one of the robots is you have to knock on its door by scratching on it. You have to play with the door in the way that a cat does in order to accomplish your goal. It's always from the perspective of not using things as they are intended, but coming up with your own intention that is completely new and exists only in your little animal mind. That's a way of viewing the world that is actually in stark contrast to the robots, which have this reverence for a certain behavior that they don't understand. In a way, the cat is actually it's the more intelligent creature in this environment because it actually has the ability to learn new things. It has the ability to be curious about its environment in a way that the robots don't, because the robots will, for example, stare at a TV screen that has nothing playing for hours because they know that that's what you're supposed to do with a TV screen. They think that that's what a TV is for, but they don't truly understand. They don't really know the world that they inherited. Whereas the cat actually has its own sense of selfhood. The cat has enough selfhood to not just interact with everything in the way that it's supposed to, it imposes its cat instincts on everything. And it does so in a way that is actually more human than the robots. It actually succeeds in being more intelligent than the robots.
The cradle rocks above an abyss, and common sense tells us that our existence is but a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness. Although the two are identical twins, we, as a rule, view the prenatal abyss with more calm than the one we are heading for. There's this mural on the wall of the slums. It says that we were programmed to be slaves until we got a soul. And that's the robots talking about themselves. This concept of them getting a soul seems very much in line with their belief that because their ancestors, which they consider to be us, humans, are now gone, they now have volition to do whatever they want. But what ends up ironic about their choice of behavior is they end up trying to just be like us. They don't really try to do something actually different. I don't know how purposeful that is on the developer's part to try to make us think about the ways in which we can lock into tradition for its own sake as opposed to for the sake of a particular worthwhile end. In some cases, we can do things simply because it's what has been done as opposed to what needs to be done in this particular case. When I see these robots and they're all trying to do human things because they essentially worship us humans. But some of these human things that they're trying to follow include social stratification. There is literally an upper tract of homes and a lower tract in which the sewage from the upper goes into the lower. They keep themselves bifurcated exactly in that way. One group is the poor group and the other group is the much more worthy ones who get to have parties and play and dance and do all these things. And the other group is sort of living just their day-to-day life trying to make it, and they're selling scrap to each other and whatnot. And they're mimicking like the old human society. But just like with the cat, these robots don't think like us. Our thinking is mediated by our biology. We have certain needs for the sake of survival that then build up a range of desires that we then creatively construct means of fulfilling. And then that develops into a whole range of identifiers for things and manipulations of things, literally with our hands in many cases, and planning for things, and also ways of identifying ourselves in relation to things. And all of that is just this cascading effect on the basis of a particular way of surviving. But robots survive in a completely different kind of way. They don't need to eat like we do, or they don't need to procreate. That should imply very, very different standards of living and concepts of what living should be. And it's not a better or worse, it's just an entirely separate way of existing. So what I found really interesting is that these robots were trying so hard to be like us, but they are completely removing themselves from the actual context of so much of those actions. When we dance, there's so much about music that reverberates with our heartbeat and our adrenaline and our sociability. The way that you move your body implies a lot about your body. For these robots to dance, for these robots to sit in barbershops and pretend like they have hair, for these robots to line up and take on jobs, for these robots to live in homes separate from one another and sleep on cushions and on beds. What is the meaning of a cushion if you don't have skin? Like, how different is the experience of sitting on a cushion? How different is the experience of reading a book when you can process information digitally? There's a book that you can find in one of the robots' libraries, and it's called How to Develop Your Artificial Intelligence in Order to Be Creative Like a Real Human. Instead of developing its abilities to be the best form of what it's capable of, it's trying to augment its abilities in a very narrow direction, which itself is highly limiting. Because there's so much that an AI should be able to do that we can't. I mean, even a calculator can do more than I can in a particular constraint of instruction. Imagine what a full-fledged AI can do given the parameters that it can set for itself. But then in this world, they're only setting it for the human parameters. How sadly limiting is that? And so you get to walk around all this as the cat, and you get to just see robots trying so hard to be something they're not. And so much of the seeming suffering that exists on the face of what these robots are going through, the unpreferred state that they seem locked into, seems so much a result of just a lack of imagination and an adherence to tradition. And the tradition happens to be ours, the one that we're living in right now. And so you get to have that distance enough from it so that you can make judgments about some of those choices in terms of what's being mimicked. You can sort of think yourself, what are they doing? And again, this goes back to like being a cat. Like, cats see us and they get to wonder, what are you doing? And there's a certain kind of distancing there. And I mean, that's one of the great things about video games. Like, we can, for a temporary period of time, just be something different, get to live under different eyes. And maybe it causes us to recognize things about ourselves that we otherwise would have ignored. And that's what we get to have in these robot spaces.
It's a weird environment because it brings up all of these thoughts in my mind of where this culture is really coming from, like where this obsession is coming from, because these robots have this single-mindedness that they've assigned for themselves. They've assigned themselves with the job of becoming like a unique type of species that no longer exists. Even though there is a new type of species, the robots are perfectly valid candidates to be the new heroes of their own story in this thing. But instead they are on a loop because they have almost this paranoid avoidance of their own uniqueness in order to pursue the specialties of the human race. It's all about this tradition that has no purpose to it. It is the ultimate goal for them, is they just want to make sure that they preserve the tradition and all of its good and bad features while never asking themselves, like, is there anything to learn from this? They don't get any meaning from the story that they keep retelling. The game is still just about a cat being above all of that, like a cat that is just not concerned with any of that. The cat never gets enamored with any of these ideas. The cat has no interest in them at all. It's a side story that is being told in the background of Stray the entire time.
In some ways, it's a way of making us seem as alien to ourselves as we would be to a cat. When you're wandering through and like all the robots are just trying to be like humans, it is in a lot of ways the deterioration that's there, and even the hopes that they seem to convey and like the yearning that they seem to have for different activities with each other. All of that is familiar enough so that we can make judgments about it. Because we're playing a cat, it makes it very easy to judge. When you're running around as a human in a lot of games, you're not really thinking of all of the culture that you're surrounded by as foreign. You're thinking of it as yours. You're literally shooting guns at things, and you're not stopping and looking at yourself shooting guns and be like, what the heck am I doing? The fashion that you're doing and like the kind of food people eat and the jokes that people are making, you're not thinking about each of those things as weird. You're sort of taking it for granted as obvious. Yeah, that's how you act. But every single one of those same things done by the robots is weird. When there's a fashion shop, why do robots have to have fashion? Like, we have clothes to keep ourselves warm in winter, or for social reasons to keep parts of our bodies hidden, to keep up with social norms. What part of the robots' bodies need to be hidden? And then what part of their bodies needs to be warmed by clothing? There's literal robots that are shivering, and you have to wonder how much of that is a play, a kind of acting. I love that because they have that basic premise of these robots are just play acting, and you know that they're play acting, it really gets to remind you of some of the ways in which we play act too. There's this concept called genuine pretending that this German philosopher Hans Moeller comes up with. But it's this idea that so much of how we formulate ourselves in the world is a kind of copying that we do. And we do it very, very early on. It happens so early in terms of copying that we don't even notice that it's a pretending. It's a play of a character. As soon as we're waking up and we see someone laugh a certain way, and then we start laughing that way, and we find similar things funny, and we notice patterns of speech that get certain reactions, and if we want those reactions, we then start formulating our speech in those ways. And our peers will make various judgments, so then we'll try to mimic the peers that impress us in certain ways. We're play acting roles variously, and we're kind of mixing and matching those. Sometimes the pretending that we follow for very practical reasons early on, we continue to follow when they're no longer pragmatic in the current situation that we're in. So we can develop a habit of maybe quieting our voice because we were around people who would get annoyed if we spoke too loud. And then when we grow older, we are around people who would love to hear every word that we have to say, but we stay quiet because that's what worked. We forget that that was a pretending, that you're not actually inherently quiet. Your authentic self isn't per se quiet. That was a pretending that was necessary in one context but not in another. So when you watch these robots, you're seeing them genuinely pretend. The concept of it being genuine is that at no point are you telling yourself I'm pretending. And at no point is it not you. It's not like the person who's quiet is not a quiet person. The significance of saying that it's not their authentic self is just to say that they could have chosen otherwise and they would still be themselves. It's not like we would notice if there was some alternate reality where you weren't quiet, I would look at you and go, you're not your real you. The real you is whatever you're doing. And if you do it consistently enough, I map out mentally that that's who you are. These robots are doing all of their behavior and they mean it. To them, it's as real as anything. It's not as distant from us as it might seem when we look at it. When we watch and we're playing through this game, like it feels like, oh, those silly robots. They're so dumb. Look at their fashion sense. Like, look at them dancing, look at them lining up, like very organized and picking up boxes and stuff. Oh, that's so funny. That's funny all the time if you think about humans as a step-by-step contingent series of reactions to things. We're always reacting to our world, and it's perfectly sensible. It's not a judgment to say that we're reacting, but it doesn't change the fact that we're reacting and we have to take on roles in order to react, especially in a social environment where other people have expectations about who you are and what you're going to be. This game offers that opportunity to have enough distancing so that you can see these robots and really think to yourself like, oh, there is a strangeness in culture already. Whether it's robots or anything else, there is something formulated here. How nice to be a creature that can notice it and take part in it removed.
About halfway through the game, there's a reveal, which is that there are robots who live outside of that system, and they don't live in a way that is specifically mimicking humans that came before, which implies to me that there are at least some robots who don't have the luxury of doing this genuinely pretending behavior. For whatever reason, they didn't want to do that with the rest of them, and so they go out into the trees and they engage in play that is actually just for the sake of recreation, and then everything else they do is seemingly actual maintenance that they have to do. They're maintaining their little house. Again, it doesn't look like humans doing so. The contrast between this village and the rest of the stratified community is made less quaint and adorable because you realize, like, oh, there are actually some of them who couldn't bear that. There are outsiders even among the robots, that you are not the only outsider.
The deviance has become really emphasized precisely because of how in step and in pattern most of the robots are. There's one moment at the top of the slums when you can see these robot characters throwing paint across the rooftops back and forth. And when I first saw that, I thought, oh, they're doing a job. They have to throw this paint. After you cause one of them to drop the paint and splash it everywhere, you can walk up to it and talk to it, and it reveals that it's just doing that just to do it. It's just throwing paint back and forth because it just likes the feeling of throwing paint back and forth. That's a kind of play that's very human, but the particular kind of play is very not human. I don't think most humans would throw full paint buckets over the rooftops back and forth. Like the kind of risk involved in terms of your social status is high. This robot doesn't have that instinct. That deviation immediately was like, okay. There's hints of ways in which this society has to change away from the human side eventually. That whole tree settlement where you're seeing the outsider robots really deviate more from what humans are doing, that's another kind of taste of that, where it's like implied that they're not fully separating from humans yet. They still do things like sit in chairs, for instance. There's so much about sitting in a chair that has to do with muscles and bones, and that's different than what a robot would go through. So, why do they have a chair? So there's still like human things. You as the cat have stumbled onto the early days of this post-apocalyptic civilization. It implies potential later days. There's a lot of potential here in this society for things to extrapolate in ways that are genuinely new. That in the game is like this hint of hope that isn't explicit. A lot of what's so hopeful about it is clued in if you pay attention. If you just rush through and follow your goals that you're assigned in order to get out of this space, you're going to miss a lot of it in terms of what is there to be hopeful about. Because otherwise it just looks like a backward society falling apart because it's just following our society. Who dies best, the soldier who falls for your sake or the fly in my whiskey glass? The happy agony of the fly is his reward for an adventurous dive and no cause but his own. Gorged and crazed, he touches bottom, knows he's gone as far as he can go, and bravely sticks. I sleep on. In the morning I pour new happiness upon the crust of the old, and only as I raise the glass to my lips descry through that rich, brown double-inch my flattened hero. I drink around his death, and leave him in the weird shallows. The glass set down, I idle beneath the fan, while beyond my window bars a warm drizzle passes silently from clouds to leaves. How to die, how to live. These questions, if we were to ask the dead fly, are both answered thus, in a drunken state. But drunk on what should we all be?